Broadcasting across the Golden State, this is Inside California Politics.
Thanks for joining us for Inside California Politics. I'm Frank Buckley in Los Angeles.
And I'm Nikki Lorenzo in Sacramento. Caitlyn Jenner making it official, announcing she is running for California governor. The reality star and former Olympian tweeted she's in and that California is worth fighting for. Our Capitol insider Ashley Zavala has more on Jenner's announcement.
Caitlyn Jenner will run as a Republican, adding some celebrity to an already wide field of candidates from that party. Caitlyn Jenner says she's in, announcing she'll run for California governor in the likely recall election of Gavin Newsom. In a statement Friday, the LGBTQ reality star and former Olympian said she's been a compassionate disruptor throughout her life and is, quote, a proven winner and the only outsider who can put an end to Gavin Newsom's disastrous time as governor. Jenner had no policy proposals posted to her website Friday, but did already have plenty of merchandise for sale.
I think today is a historic day, and I think, we wish her the very best of luck.
Recall organizer Randy Economy says the effort to replace Gavin Newsom has entered a new phase.
Like we've always said, we didn't think that the front runners had emerged yet in this campaign, and I think today is proves our point.
Well, I think this is the opening act of the circus that is the recall.
Democratic strategist Stephen Maviglio was press secretary for Governor Gray Davis, who was recalled and replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I don't think she's on the same level as Arnold Schwarzenegger at all. Schwarzenegger came into that recall in 2003 with some policy chops. He'd led a ballot initiative the year before. He was married to Maria Shriver, who has a lot of political recognition. And we're not seeing this at all here.
Team Newsom noting Jenner is working with Donald Trump's former presidential campaign manager. Newsom's campaign manager, Dan Newman, said in a statement, quote, "We always knew the Republican recall would be a ludicrous circus full of Trump supporters, which only reinforces how much Californians appreciate Governor Newsom's competent, compassionate, experienced leadership during an unprecedented series of crises." Meanwhile, Jenner says a more formal announcement and updates are coming in a matter of weeks. For Inside California Politics, I'm Ashley Zavala.
And as Ashley mentioned, Jenner does not have a clear campaign platform outlined on her website, but has spoken out about issues that mattered to her in the past. In 2018, she penned an op-ed for the Washington Post stating homelessness, job discrimination, health care access, mental health, and violence against transgender people are at the top of her list. Jenner is joining a handful of other candidates looking to unseat Governor Newsom, but the field looks very different from the 2003 recall.
Arnold, when he joined the race, he was a guy with nearly 100% name recognition. He had, if you talk to people who worked on his campaign, they say he had more name recognition than the Pope, and arguably better poll numbers. And he also was a legitimate. He had some sort of legitimacy in the political world too. He had run a ballot measure. He had campaigned for George H.W. Bush, so he was a known quantity. Republicans want there to be an Arnold right now. Right now, they don't have an Arnold. And so without an Arnold, it's bad for Republicans. And as you say, the freak show is going to be magnified.
Jeremy.
I think Joe is exactly right. And I think that the key thing, as Joe said, that Arnold Schwarzenegger had was celebrity and name recognition. And there are already a few Republicans in the race, and I don't think any of them have that same sort of excitement around them and celebrity stature. I do think that we are probably going to get scores of candidates in this race. And given that it's really the main event on the election calendar around the country this year, I think it's still going to be a circus in terms of the amount of national attention that's on this race.
Well, following the guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial, Bay Area Congresswoman Barbara Lee is focusing on the future of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And while she says it was the verdict she was hoping for, the announcement came with mixed emotions.
There is no way that a not guilty verdict could come back when, in fact, the prosecution presented the facts, presented the truth. And I know Attorney General Keith Ellison very well. And I know he put together that prosecution team to seek the truth and to make sure that the truth be told. And so I was very, I guess, relieved in many ways when the verdict was guilty, guilty, guilty. But also I realized that so many Black and brown people have died as a result of police murders that this just barely cracked the door to police accountability, because real justice would have meant that Mr. Floyd would not be dead, nor countless others of Black and brown people. So while this was quite a moment, a defining moment, it should never have been an aberration. This should be the case all along if true justice existed in this country for African Americans, especially as it relates to police misconduct and brutality and murders.
I want to ask you about the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Of course, the House passed that back in March. The president came out, President Biden, after that verdict was read, and he spoke to the nation. He said it shouldn't take a whole year to get this done, and he says he will sign it as quickly as possible if it does make it through the Senate. Of course, an uphill battle in the Senate. Are you optimistic that this bill will make it through the Senate?
Well, I have a lot of hope. You know, we've passed it in the House, I believe, twice. And it's time. And I'm glad that President Biden and Vice President Harris really came out very strong and said that this must be done. And of course, Congresswoman Bass, Senator Booker, and Senator Scott are working to try to get bipartisan support for this. And I'm cautiously optimistic that that's going to happen. It must be done. You know, this is a moderate measure. I mean, mandating data collection on police encounters, establishing a national standard for the operation of actually police forces in terms of how the police operate, streamlining federal law to be able to prosecute excessive force, banning chokeholds, banning the sale and the distribution of weapons of war on the streets and to police departments in America. All of these are very moderate measures. And then, of course, ending qualified immunity. No one should be above the law. If a person is found guilty of a crime, a person should be held responsible. And so I hope that this measure passes. I'm confident in those who are negotiating it. They're negotiating in good faith. They know what they're doing, and they're trying to bring Republicans and Democrats to support the bill so that it can get, by next month, we're hoping, to President Biden's desk.
All right, I want to also ask you about a bill that passed the House this past week. It would make D.C. the 51st state. So after the House voted, you tweeted this: D.C. statehood is about racial justice. D.C. statehood is about voting rights. D.C. statehood is about equal protection under the law. Expand on that.
Well, I've been in this fight for D.C. statehood since I worked for our beloved, the late Congressman Ron Dellums. There should be, first of all, no taxation without representation in this country. Secondly, the District of Columbia has a large percentage of African Americans who have been totally disenfranchised. In our country, where D.C. has sent our young men and women to war, they have volunteered to go to war. We pay federal taxes. D.C. residents pay federal taxes. So why in the world are they disenfranchised from having the right to vote and having a representative in the House and in the Senate? So it's outrageous. And when you look at the fact that, you know, voting rights should really apply to the District of Columbia residents. And so they have been disenfranchised over the years. And there are a large percentage of African Americans who do everything that our country asks us to do, and still we can't vote for a federal representative. It's outrageous.
And just for some context here before we wrap up, in the 2020 presidential election, 92% of voters in D.C. went to Biden, 5% to Trump. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Congressmember Barbara Lee, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Nice being with you.
Coming up, freshman Congressman Jay Obernolte weighs in on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, why he says Republicans didn't support that legislation. Bipartisan cooperation is often promised by politicians on the campaign trail, and new Congressman Jay Obernolte says it's still a priority for him now that he's in office. Congressman Obernolte, you said police reform is one of those nonpartisan issues, and yet you joined every Republican in the House but one in opposing the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, sponsored by LA's Democratic Representative Karen Bass. Why are you and other Republicans opposing that the police reform measures in that bill?
Well, I think we support the vast majority of the provisions of that bill. But there are a couple of specific provisions of that bill that are highly problematic for us. For example, the ending of the practice of qualified immunity for police officers. That's something that prevents frivolous lawsuits against officers that are following all the rules, but just trying to do their jobs. Also, there is a prohibition in there against any police department acquiring surplus military equipment. And my own law enforcement agencies in my congressional district have told me that they rely on things like surplus military helicopters to conduct search and rescue missions. So if we deny them that, we're denying them a valuable tool and creating a lot of more expense for that. So for them. So we have co-sponsored a piece of legislation called the Justice Act that contains most of the provisions of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and we think is a broad bipartisan piece of legislation that could provide a real pathway forward and meaningful reforms to our criminal justice system.
Another issue that has garnered bipartisan support in the past is infrastructure spending. President Trump promised $1 trillion plan, and while he never delivered on it, Republicans supported the idea of infrastructure spending. Now they're opposed to it when it's proposed by President Biden. Why do you think that is? And aren't there ways that federal infrastructure monies could benefit your district?
Oh, well, we should be able to find a way to work together on this. Infrastructure is definitely a bipartisan issue. This idea that we come together and government exists to provide for us collectively what we're unable to do individually, things like roads and streets and bridges and dams. And these have been bipartisan issues for centuries. So the problem is the definition of infrastructure. If you look at the most recent administration proposal, and you look at the total amount of that proposal that's being allocated to infrastructure, roads and bridges, streets, highways, all of that put together, less than 6%. If you total up everything that could be even charitably described as infrastructure in the entire bill, less than a quarter of it. And the rest of it goes for things like expansion of Medicaid, things like there's a large chunk for electric vehicle purchase subsidies. So these are things that we should sit down and talk about, not to say that they're not good ideas, but to call them infrastructure, I think, is disingenuous. And especially, we all have to remember that every single dollar of this package has to be borrowed, because right now, government runs a budget deficit, which means that any additional dollar that we spend on infrastructure is going to add to the national debt, and it's something that we're going to leave to our children and their grandchildren to pay. So infrastructure, by definition, is something we should be willing to invest in, but it means we need to be very careful about what we define as infrastructure and what we don't define as infrastructure. And this package, less than a quarter of it being for actual infrastructure, I think is what we object to.
Coming up on Inside California Politics, infrastructure and climate change, how Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg says the American Jobs Plan will directly impact all Californians. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is taking on climate change and says passing the American Jobs Plan is the way to do it. Not only does he believe transportation policy can help reduce greenhouse gases, he says every infrastructure decision is ultimately a climate decision. Secretary Buttigieg, great to have you on Inside California Politics.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, so we are a statewide political show. We have viewers the Bay Area, Central Valley, and LA. How will the American Jobs Plan affect the people of California?
Well, every community in California, from the biggest cities to rural areas, will see the impact of the American Jobs Plan because it's designed for the entire country. We're talking about roads and bridges, ports and airports, transit and trains, but also, importantly, a broader definition of infrastructure that reminds us that we need to do things like take the lead out of service pipes going to homes. We got to do things like get every single American a good broadband internet connection. All of these things fit together, and they're going to create benefits in every community and, importantly, support jobs in every community too.
Our governor, Gavin Newsom, has called this jobs plan a, quote, game changer. I want to ask you, as secretary, you've said that every infrastructure decision is inevitably a climate decision too. Do you believe the decisions you make as transportation secretary could have an impact on the planet as well? And how so?
There's no question about it. You know, in our economy, the transportation sector is the single biggest contributor of greenhouse gases. So that means every choice we make about transportation is already a climate decision, whether we recognize it or not. This Earth Day, we're paying a lot of attention to what we can do to make sure that people have alternatives to getting around in a car with quality transit-oriented development, transit options and support for all forms of mobility, but also for those who are in cars, making sure they're cleaner by supporting electric vehicle infrastructure. And just as important, making sure those electric vehicles are made in the US. You know, that's the direction that cars are headed, but it's far from guaranteed that the EVs of the near future will be made by American companies and American workers on American soil. You got to do something about that, and that's a big part of the American Jobs Plan.
Climate, obviously a big issue here in California. We see wildfires, and also just this past week, the governor has declared a drought emergency. What do you say to the critics that have called this just, you know, a Republican or, pardon me, a Democratic wish list? What do you say to the Republicans that have called it that?
Well, you could view this as an American wish list because Americans of both parties have been wishing for a long time to have better infrastructure. Look, we're not even in the top 10 anymore. We are ranked 13th as a country, coasting off of infrastructure decisions that were made generations or decades ago, and that is catching up to us. We cannot be the leading economy in the world if we don't have the best airports and ports in the world, if we continue to have thousands of miles of roads in California alone, including the part that we saw sliding into the ocean not long ago on US 1, in poor condition. We've got to do better. And I know Washington is a little different from the way people think around the country, but around the country, most Americans already want the provisions that are in this jobs plan because they're good policy. So let's not worry about what to call it, what kind of label to slap on it. Let's worry about how to get it done, because I think most communities don't need to be sold on the idea of improving our infrastructure.
Are you engaging with Republicans on this?
Absolutely. I'm in touch with Republicans in the House and Senate every day because the president has instructed us to pursue a bipartisan approach. Matter of fact, I started this week on Monday in the Oval Office with the president and Republican and Democratic members of the House and the Senate. We really want to engage, to hear other ideas, and to try to get there together, because I think this is one of the most bipartisan areas out there. Now, of course, we have a clear vision, and we think it's the best one. It's paid for without raising taxes on ordinary Americans. Just by improving the corporate tax rate and improving, or I should say, closing a lot of loopholes. But there are other ideas out there. We want to hear them and try to earn as many votes as we possibly can from both sides of the aisle on a bill that we can all be proud of.
That's really been the big sticking point on the Republican side, too, is how to pay for this, raising the corporate tax rate, because the argument is that that is going to hurt the economy as we're trying to bounce back from the pandemic. To that, you say what?
Well, I would say that a Wall Street firm like Moody's took a look at the plan and concluded that we will have 2.7 million more jobs if we do pass it than if we don't pass it. Look, for most of my lifetime, the corporate tax rate has been 35. We're saying it ought to be 28. So lower than it's been for most of my lifetime. American business can absolutely compete, but the idea of continuing to have corporations pay sometimes zero, even when they're making billions of dollars in profits, doesn't make any sense. The American people already get that, and that's probably why when Americans are asked about this plan, support for it actually goes up when we talk about how we're proposing to pay for it.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, we thank you so much for your time here on Inside California Politics.
Great being with you. Thank you.
Coming up, Rob Bonta is now California's first Filipino-American Attorney General. What he plans to do in his new role. Rob Bonta is the first Filipino-American to become Attorney General for the state of California. He's taking over the reins at the Department of Justice at a time when state leaders are calling for more support for the Asian and Pacific Islander community and more police accountability. Here again is our Capitol Insider, Ashley Zavala.
Such an honor. So humbling, overwhelming.
Rob Bonta says he's ready to take on his new role as California Attorney General, but he'd prefer to be considered something other than the state's top cop.
I see the role as the people's attorney. I know people call it the top cop, but I like the people's attorney because I think the role of this position in this office is to fight for everyday folks who are being hurt, harmed, mistreated, abused by those who are abusing their power.
Bonta will fill the vacant seat left by now U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra. Bonta has spent the last 9 years as a progressive Bay Area assemblyman at the forefront of pushes to end cash bail and strengthen laws on hate crimes. In his new role, he's promising to prioritize more action on police accountability.
To do things differently, to reimagine different ways that are more fair, more just, more compassionate, and safer. And I'm committed to working with all the stakeholders to accomplish that, including our law enforcement personnel, who are invaluable parts of our communities, and the vast majority of whom want to do what is necessary to build what is currently missing in too many places in too many ways, and that is trust.
California lawmakers in both houses Thursday confirmed Bonta's nomination, passing 62-0 in the Assembly and 29-6 in the Senate.
I think it is critical that we, California, have a progressive voice as Attorney General.
Republican caucus members say they appreciated Bonta's will to work across the aisle in this position, but ultimately decided to not support the nomination.
We are still somewhat concerned regarding his past.
What do you say to those, now that you take on this statewide role, who are, maybe moderates in the Central Valley, people who are more conservative, closer to the foothills? What do you say to those folks who might have a little pause with you being in this position?
I will be the Attorney General for all, and watch and let me prove that to you.
Bonta will have about a year to prove himself to voters. He says he will run for the office in 2022. In Sacramento, for Inside California Politics, I'm Ashley Zavala.
You can see more of our interviews online. Just head to your local station's website and click on the Inside California Politics drop-down. Thank you for joining us for Inside California Politics.
We'll see you back here next weekend.